Hello everybody, I hope you're all keeping well. I'm going to be reading a little bit more of the Twits for you. So we're on to Mrs. Twit. Mrs. Twit was no better than her husband. She did not, of course, have a hairy face. It was a pity she didn't, because at any rate it would have hidden some of her fearful ugliness. Take a look at her. There you go. There's a little picture of her. Have you ever seen a woman with an uglier face than that? I very much doubt it. But the funny thing is that Mrs. Twit wasn't born ugly. She had quite a nice face when she was young. The ugliness had grown upon her year by year as she got older. Now, why would that happen? I'll tell you why. If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on the face. And when that person has ugly thoughts every day, every week and every year, the face gets uglier and uglier until it gets so ugly you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts cannot ever be ugly. You can have a wonky nose and a crooked mouth and a double chin and sticky out teeth, but if you have good thoughts, they will shine out of your face like sunbeams and you will always look lovely. Nothing shone out of Mrs. Twit's face. In her right hand, she carried a walking stick. She used to tell people that this was because she had warts growing on the soles of her left foot and walking was painful. But the real reason she carried a walking stick was so that she could hit things like dogs and cats and very small children. And then there was the glass eye. Mrs. Twit had a glass eye, and that was always looking the other way. Now we'll move on to the glass eye. You can play a lot of tricks with a glass eye because you can take it out and pop it back in at any time you like. You bet your life Mrs. Twit knew all the tricks. One morning she took out her glass eye and dropped it into Mr. Twit's mug of beer when he wasn't looking. Mr. Twit sat there drinking beer slowly, the froth and the white ring on the hairs around his mouth. He wiped the froth from his face onto his sleeve and wiped his sleeve onto his trousers. "You're plotting something," Mrs. Twit said, keeping her back turned so he wouldn't see that she'd taken out her glass eye. "Whenever you go all quiet, I know you're plotting something." Mrs. Twit was right. Mr. Twit was plotting away like mad. He was trying to think up a really nasty trick that he could play on his wife that day. "You'd better be careful," Mrs. Twit said, "because if I start seeing you plotting, I'll watch you like a wombat." "Oh, do shut up, you old hag," Mr. Twit said. He went on drinking his beer, and his evil mind kept working away on the horridest latest trick that he was going to play on the old woman. Suddenly, as if Mr. Twit had last dropped the beer down his throat, he caught sight of Mrs. Twit's awful glass eye staring up at him from the bottom of the mug. It made him jump. "Oh! I told you I was watching you," she cackled. "I've got eyes everywhere, so you better be careful." The next bit, the frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided to put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bath getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between the sheets. Then he got out of his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back and climbed into her bed and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Then, all at once, she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. "Ah!" she screamed. "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit, bouncing about. "There's something in my bed." "I'll bet it's just that giant silly wriggler I saw on the floor just now," said Mr. Twit. "That what?" screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away," Mr. Twit said. It's got teeth like screwdrivers. Help! Screamed Mrs Twit. Save me! It's all over my feet. It'll bite off your toes, said Mr Twit. Mrs Twit fainted. Ugh. Mr Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water. He poured all the water over Mrs Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping all over her pillows. Frogs love water. This one was having a great time. When Mrs Twit came to, the frog had just jumped on her face. This was not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night. She screamed again. Ah! By golly, it is a giant squidwiggler, Mr Twit said. It'll bite off your nose. Mrs Twit leapt out of bed and flew downstairs and spent the night on the sofa. The frog went in to sleep on her pillow. And we're finished there.